I've been using Blender for about a month now, so I thought I would do 30 creativity lessons, thoughts on creativity, as I'm learning Blender through sort of that lens. So let's get started. Number one, deleting objects. Same, but different. So the first thing that you might try to do is delete the cube. It's the first barrier a lot of people hit because you hit backspace, it doesn't work. You hit delete, it doesn't work. You have to press X to delete it and then confirm it. And it seems pretty weird at first. There's this book, Psychology of Money, which is not a book about creativity, it's about personal finance. But one of the chapters is called Nobody's Crazy. There are usually pretty good reasons that people behave in certain ways with their money. And this is sort of applicable beyond finances. And this is just similar to Blender, where it has this long history as software and many shortcuts. Probably there is a reason that they're set up this way. From what I can gather, the shortcuts are set up so that you keep your left hand on the left side of the keyboard and then your right hand mostly on the mouse, and then sometimes pressing the number pad. Delete or like backspace is kind of in the middle of that. So X makes it possible to delete things without having to move your hands. Then number two, primitives and learning the fundamentals. So after deleting the cube, a lot of beginner tutorials have you add the cube back in because you need something to manipulate and transform. And then, of course, there are plenty of other fundamental shapes, primitives that you can use to create worlds. How this applies to creativity, it's good to learn the fundamentals of a craft. So what are the core artifacts that you're going to be making? What are the core tools that you'll be working with? What are the chunks that you need to learn? As an example for storytelling, it's some form of beginning, middle, and end. There are simple ways to do that. There are more complex ways to do that. You'll need to practice the fundamentals. But first, it's learning what the fundamentals are in the first place. Number three, move. And this is about moving different shapes. So I've done a lot of 2D UI design with some motion. So actually, like, this time aspect of motion is something I have a little bit of familiarity with, but it's really that third dimension of just adding like the Z-axis in that starts to get a little bit tricky with 2D design. Maybe it's like thinking about layers overlapping with each other, but not to the degree of 3D Z-axis and needing to think about that. I'm getting the hang of it, but I still feel like I'm moving way too slow to make the things that I want to make. I don't really know how to place things properly, so it'll be like, oh, I've just placed something at the world origin, and then I drag the arrows to where it needs to go, and then just keep adjusting from there. And this reminds me, just creativity-wise, of this quote from Naval Ravikant. It's be impatient with action and patient with results. So I am making this video about using Blender for a month, but I'm not super satisfied, I guess, with the progress that I've made in the month. I thought I would be further along. So some of that might be having skewed expectations. I watched some videos of other creators that have X days with Blender videos, and they make amazing things by the end of even 30 days. So compared to that, it's like I'm not that far along. Then some of it is on me, and maybe that's setting, like, maybe I looked at the best videos, so those are the best results that some of the best creators coming from other art disciplines had, and that's not like a typical result. But then some of it actually is just on me. During these past few weeks, I have just gotten distracted on different days, tinkering with projects instead of progressing through courses. And it's usually pretty obvious when I go through a course or tutorial that I've sort of like added to my toolbox. It's not the biggest toolbox right now, but then it is just sometimes more interesting or like more fun to be tinkering on a project, like trying to execute on some idea that I have in my head. But it isn't all that can be good for stretching myself, but still there are just these fundamental things I need to learn in the first place. So that's it. Yeah, that idea, impatient action and being patient with the results. It's more about being patient with the results that I need to focus on. It's not all going to happen in a month. Number four, extrude and subdivide, and this is about flexibility. So in edit mode, or you can switch between like object mode, edit mode. I'm sure there are other modes that I will learn, but in edit mode, you have complete control over points for different shapes, or you can select points and manipulate those. You can select edges, manipulate those, or faces and manipulate those. And it's pretty cool to think that every photorealistic image or like VFX thing somehow breaks down into these points and these basic shapes. At the same time, it's also overwhelming to think of all of the different ways that you can make things and manipulate things. So then there's a few different actions that you can take of like extruding and subdividing things, and then you take the basic shape and then create more subshapes is probably the wrong word, but is it it's probably not even polygons, but it gives you more flexibility with the shape, so you can start to manipulate it in different ways and bend the things and move things. And that idea of flexibility reminds me of something I heard on a podcast recently, and I think it was Ryan Holiday, but it's this line between routine and superstition that it's nice to have, say, the short morning routine to get into a focused state, but you don't want it to get to this superstition level. I think the story is about like a baseball player that never wanted to have a routine because he didn't want to be like feel restricted. If he was off the routine, that would hurt his mentality. And this is about having that flexibility in the routine, that if things don't go perfectly, that's fine. Just make the adjustment and then continue working. So I have this short morning routine, mostly taking care of my dog Booster and then having some coffee and then trying to get into Blender, but mostly I get distracted for the first 20 minutes. It's not great. And I kind of know that, but I try my best to not, kick myself too much for that or punish myself and feel badly about that. It's just like, okay, let me steer myself in the right direction. I'll be a little bit flexible here and then adjust from there. So having that flexibility in the routine so that it is not superstition that I miss a step in the routine, then now I can't do anything for the rest of my day. Number 5, scale and building a habit. One of my favorite things about learning 3D is just this sense of scale that you can create, either by literally making some things much bigger than other things, or by making dozens or hundreds of shapes. You can just create it through like quantity or physical scale. It's the end of the year, and I usually re-listen to a rotation of audiobooks, but this idea of scale reminded me of Atomic Habits. It's very cliche, it's the most popular like nonfiction book of I don't know, the last decade or something like that, some genre of nonfiction. And I was actually listening to it yesterday, and it reminded me of this idea of scaling habits down. So there's the whole step in the Atomic Habits framework there's one step in the framework, make it easy. And one of the ways to do that is to break the habit down into a 2-minute habit. So one of my favorite things from when James Clear was doing interviews on all these different podcasts was he'd often do this lightning round. The host would ask him to break down a few habits they're working on into 2-minute habits. So it's not about going to the gym, it's about putting your shoes on. And it's that first thing that helps you slide into the rest of the habit. Right now I'm trying to remove the friction in the morning to get to a Blender tutorial or like to continue on with a Blender course. And for the most part, this really means just setting my computer up the night before, have the course video open and then have Blender open, and so that I can like just get started on it. Number 6, nodes and the power of previous knowledge. So at some point you're going to see node tree in Blender. For me, the first time I remember was when working on like tutorials for lava and ice. I wanted to see how can I create like something that looks like lava. And the good thing is I had a little bit of luck here with some skill transfer. As mentioned, I've done 2D UI design, and a tool I learned a little bit of is called Origami. Earlier versions of it were add-ons to Apple's Quartz Composer, and these tools had a node tree. So I wasn't completely unfamiliar with using a node-based editor, but I definitely remember how intimidating it was to learn Origami additionally, because it was just like software. I've used different tools, but that was the first time I used a node editor with the patches and connecting the different inputs and outputs. So I don't have a grasp of the different things that you can do in, say, like the shader editor. So I don't know what each individual block will let me do, but I'm glad I can somewhat skip some initial intimidation of just knowing, these inputs connect to these outputs. I numbered these in 6 sections with 5 different things underneath them. But so number 7, emission, and not a emission, but is it a texture or what is it, a material, or like a material option where you can set an object to have emission, so its own light. And creatively, this reminds me of that idea that you can drive a long way with just your headlights. You don't have to have this full map and outcome of what you want to get to in every sub-step along the way, where for me it's just this sort of like broad thing of I want to learn Blender. I'm starting to get an idea of what I want to be able to create in the future. I think it would be like these abstract animations. But I also want to make sure I'm learning the fundamentals as well. And yeah, it's this idea that if you have a car with headlights on and there aren't street lights, all you have is the light in front of you. You can still, I mean, assuming there's like a paved road there as well, you can get a long way just using your headlights. Just a different way to put this is, I've heard Sean Puri from the My First Million podcast. He talks about A, B, Z planning. So Z is like kind of the end goal that you have in mind. And then A is where you are now. And then B is kind of just the next step. So what's the next step? What's something that will be useful to learn right now that will move you toward that more abstract goal? You don't need all the letters in between, just A, B, Z. And then number 8, the array modifier. This is a cool one to be able to, make objects, multiple objects, and then eventually apply that and separate them into separate objects. And then you can combine these other modifiers and probably in endless ways that I haven't learned yet to do different cool things. But you want to be able to integrate those eventually. And in creative work, it's good to figure out what to isolate and what to integrate. So you can isolate different skills and then practice those individually to improve those. And then eventually you want to integrate those. So but if you only do drills or if you only integrate, especially only integrate, if you're only integrating, then it's like playing pickup basketball without practicing the skills individually. It's probably most obvious with shooting. So if you get 100 shots up, it's going to take forever if you're trying to do that through pickup games, and you'll get 100 shots up much faster if you're working alone on an empty court. But then it's also just that balance of what's the point of doing all these drills if you're never going to integrate them? What's the point of just drill, like doing basketball drills, but never playing the game, like playing games? Okay, so number 9, subdivision and learning the history of an industry. In one of the tutorials, and this comes up often where at some point you do this, I think it's the subdivision modifier, and the default option is the Catmull-Clark subdivision. And then seeing that, I remembered, I read that book about what is it called? It's the Pixar book Creativity Inc. And it's by Ed Catmull. And yes, this Catmull-Clark subdivision, I think it's an algorithm, is half, like one of the people is Ed Catmull. And it's always fun to learn about the history of the industry, and it can be useful as well to some point. But the more fun part is just learning 3D and then seeing something like the metallic option on a shader and then realizing that what probably happened, say 30 years ago, is there were these different 3D games, and then you would have Dural in Virtua Fighter, who was this metallic character, and then Metal Mario in Mario 64. And my guess is that these exist because developers saw the T-1000 from Terminator 2, and then they had the ability to turn a metallic setting all the way up in the 3D design software that they were using for game development. And then they kind of figured things out from there. So I assume it was probably working backwards. Oh, cool, we have this really cool looking Metal Mario now. What game mechanics can we get from that? It makes sense that Metal Mario would be a little bit heavier. What does that mean? He can walk underwater. And yeah, it's just cool to be learning about 3D, just learning about a new industry. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what happened, but I would guess it's something like that. This is number 10, painting, simulating the real world. I kept making this Buster Sword. In my previous videos, I've talked about this Buster Sword way too much. But at some point, I was able to get it to export and then import it into Procreate, which is drawing software on the iPad. And it was very, very satisfying to be able to like paint directly on this 3D object. It felt like I was working on something, I put in quotes like real, because it just felt direct, that I'm moving my Apple Pencil and then it's painting on this object. And that directness is the idea that I took in thinking about that through creative work, is the importance of doing the actual thing itself. And this somewhat relates to the idea of isolating and integrating as you're learning something. So there's this romantic idea that comes from Jiro Dreams of Sushi, of the apprentice who worked with rice only for 3 years, something like that. At the same time, it's kind of like, I like that movie or that documentary. But then also, what if that person instead had a master that was teaching him how to make sushi. Like he could touch the sushi, like the fish during that 3 years, and he was making the fish directly for 3 years. I think that would be good too. There are a lot of ways to win, and I think that's going to get to some of the other lessons here. Continue on, number 11, lights. I don't know what I don't know. So going into it, I didn't think I'd be thinking about lights so much. Lighting is important in 2D art as well, but I'm not exactly like an expert in 2D art either. In any case, when you're drawing, it's not like you draw with a pen and then ink with a pen, or draw with a pencil, ink with a pen, then whip out a light bulb and move that around to do the lighting. Instead, you think of, you like kind of like establish the lighting and then incorporate that as you're doing the drawing. Not until I started going through these Blender tutorials did I start learning how important lighting is in 3D. That's probably one of those things that's very obvious to someone who is not a complete beginner, or even obvious to some beginners as well. But yeah, it's just something where I didn't know what I didn't know, that you're going to have to set up these lights, and there's all sorts of different lights, and there's all sorts of cool things that you can do with the lights. Number 12, cel shaders, and the idea of making things you enjoy until you enjoy making those things. The 3D cartoon look was something that got me interested in learning Blender in the first place. I saw someone drawing and then rotating that piece in 3D. That seemed really, really cool to me. Growing up, my parents got me a Dreamcast on launch day. I'll always remember 9999. That's the US launch day. So one of the iconic games on that console was Jet Set Radio. And one of the reasons it was so popular, the gameplay was there, but also just the graphics. That's one of the first cel-shaded games, if not the first. And it's just this style that I always wanted to learn to make. Naval Ravikant has this tweet about how you should read what you enjoy until you enjoy reading. You don't need to start reading with sophisticated things. It's okay to just read fiction that you enjoy, even if other people think it's like lowbrow fiction or whatever. And this also is sort of what distracted me. Is I did this tutorial on cel shading and outlining, doing the line art with grease pencil, and then for a few days I got kind of obsessed with doing physics simulations in this style because I was just enjoying it. It's still very early on, but I do think that abstract animation style will be what I want to dive into in the future. When it becomes time to specialize in something, I still think it's important to build up that base, but it's certainly one of the more fun things that I've made in this first month. Number 13, bloom setup and flexibility versus ease of use. So these two things are often at odds with each other. I was following a tutorial with a new version of Blender, and it showed how to set up bloom. You open up this compositor, and then you have to do a little bit in the node editor. And then I followed a tutorial that was using an older version of Blender, and they're doing sort of the project setup as well. And it's just like, just check a box and then bloom is turned on. And I thought, that's weird. That's easier in the old version. Then just reading through the comments, people say, oh, it does give you a lot more control. It's not just a checkbox, but it gives you control. And that's all often a trade-off, is just to make something more flexible, give more control, and then you have to sacrifice like some ease of use there. Number 14, and feedback loops. So I take for granted what Eevee brings to the table. I couldn't really even at this point tell you or describe it. I don't know what it was like before that. I know that there's the other option cycles. At this point, yeah, a month in, I should probably be able to explain the difference. I don't really know what it is, so I should learn that. That said, if it's helping to make feedback loops faster, then I'm very grateful for it. I do think it has to do something with, again, it's trade-offs. So there's a speed of rendering, but the trade-off is probably it's not as accurate. So that said, the fast feedback loops are what make Blender addicting, in that you try something, you see it work or not immediately, and then you try again. And this is something that attracted me to Blender in the first place as something to learn. About a month ago, I was thinking, what should I try to learn in, say, the next year? Or even I was thinking like bigger picture, like next 5 years, maybe thinking a little too much ahead. And I knew I wanted it to be something more visual. I was making a few videos about learning Swift and learning Vision Pro, and coding would be a really useful skill to learn. Or getting back into coding. I used to, once upon a time, I programmed and been paid for it, but it was pretty simple jQuery JavaScript, nothing too complicated. But it's always been something related to something visual and having a visual feedback loop. Doing something and then seeing the result of it visually is something I've always enjoyed. So having that feedback loop is important, figuring out the feedback loop in your own creative work that you want to have. Number 15, reuse and building once, rendering twice. So once you've made something in Blender, you've modeled, composed, animated things, it's really cool how there are so many ways to then reuse or tweak things to create something new. You can change the lighting, add some shapes, change the animation, just endless ways to do things. And then you have something new on your hands. One of my favorite creators on the internet is Jack Butcher. He has a phrase, build once, sell twice. And it's that idea of you're doing a lot of stuff up front, but then now you have something that you can repeat over and over and over and tweak over and over and over and have something new. So with creative work, it can be good to build systems to reuse what you've already made. I'm still trying to figure that out. Sort of meta, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this video. I wrote this long outline of 30 things, and I hope that I'm not only using it for this video. I hope that then I can break these into shorts and try to reuse it that way. And I've also just been recording a lot with OBS as I'm in Blender to create like time lapses of what I'm making. Hopefully I'll use that in the future, but it is just this idea of reuse. And that's also like a core thing to just the 3D community and other like art communities as well, is that people make their kits available either for free or for sale, and then you can reuse that and reuse these assets, and having an asset library that you can do to build your scenes up. These next 5 will be about animation. So number 16, keyframes, and what's the end result and what are the key steps along the way. So this is something I'm learning as I'm learning animation, is that you have your starting point and then you have the end result that you want to have, and then the keyframes along the way. And then hopefully like the things in between will be automatic, and I'm learning to do that. But in creative work, I guess this is kind of repeating that idea of the headlights and the ABZ thing of you are where you're at, you have the end result that you want to have in mind, and then it is kind of like maybe a step beyond ABZ. Maybe this is more like ABELQZ. So a few keyframes to get to the end result. What are some milestones that you want to hit for the creative work, and how are you going to measure your progress as you're going along the way? On number 17, looping, and back where you started, but maybe, I guess, so this is something that I'm trying to learn, and I've started doing this Ducky 3D course about, it's like the intro to animation, and he does a lot of looping animations, and one of the key ideas there is that you set up your range that you're going to do with your animation, and then you start with frame 0, and then the last frame will be the same as the frame 0 so that it loops clean. And this just reminds me of, coming back to where you started, but with more skills. And it's similar to like New Game Plus and Chrono Trigger, that you beat the game and then you can start the game back where you started, but you bring all the attributes that you had. So then you feel very powerful. And this can be a cool thing when you encounter something again and you realize you have a better understanding of it after you've been working with it for a few months. So now I open Blender, I'm not completely intimidated. I go into object mode, or switch from object mode to edit mode. I'm not completely intimidated. And that's progress. I feel like that's progress, not opening up a different tab, not being completely clueless as I open it up. So I'm back where I started, but with a little more knowledge. Number 18, physics, and this idea that it's not entirely in your control. Again, as mentioned, I was doing these cel-shaded animations, and a lot of them were using physics. So I would make a bunch of different cubes and then drop them on objects and then see what happens. And that was a very addicting feedback loop, but also it could be a thing where I had some end results in mind, and then I thought I was just a minute away, like just tweak a little bit and it's going to work. But sometimes it would be like an hour later or 90 minutes later where I would finally get to what I wanted. And some of it is that it wasn't in my control. I would just like set the things up, set the objects up, and then I was trying to get like a ball to roll across a gap, and I would hit play and then just see what happens. So I could set up like the initial state, but then I would just have to wait and see what happens. And for creativity, this reminds me of that not everything is in your control. So it's picking those input goals and the output goals. Yes, it would be great to have an output goal. Oh, it'd be great if this video got 1,000 views, but that's kind of out of my control at a certain. I can work on the video, try to make it write a script, write this outline, and then put it out into the world. And then maybe it ends up with 30 views. It might. That's actually more possible or more likely than it getting to 1,000 views. But yeah, it's just not in my control. And all I can really focus on is like trying to make the inputs better, like having my own standard for what I think would be like good enough for a video, or good for a video that I made, or for, like 3D models or animation that I made. Number 19, rigging and connecting the dots. So I have not done a lot of rigging. Actually, I think I've only really done it once I tried to make this whip for this video about Battle Arena Toshinden. The whip didn't even turn out very good at all. It was just it looks more like a branch. I wasn't following the tutorial very closely. I just kind of wanted to have a little bit of experience. How does rigging work anyway? So you create the bones and then you can animate them, and then moving one thing moves the rest if they're connected together. And this is that idea of connecting the dots. I made a short about this, and this Steve Jobs quote, I don't have the quote verbatim, but it's the idea that in life you are learning different things. So you first are just collecting dots, and then eventually over time those dots connect, and you can only connect the dots looking backwards. So it is almost like creating a bunch of different bones and then realizing looking backwards that some of them actually did connect. That thing that you learned earlier on helped apply later. And the example with Apple, I think it was that he took like a calligraphy class in college, and then eventually that helped shaped his philosophy with Apple and the Macintosh, and that it was important to get the text right, the typography right. Number 20, fracture, and this idea that you have to crack the egg. I have not actually made anything that uses this, but I did watch a video, and I do want to try to do this, where it's this effect where the wall breaks and then all these balls start to fall out of it. And I think there is a plugin that allows you to like take an object and you fracture it, and it just will do like the physics simulation, but it breaks a solid object into different parts. And the creativity idea here is that you have to crack the eggs. You have to crack an egg to cook the eggs. This is another thing from Sean Puri from My First Billion, but it's this idea that you can watch all the tutorials you want about how to cook scrambled eggs. You can read about it, all these things, but to really start learning it, you have to crack an egg and try to cook an omelet. And yeah, that is something I try to remind myself, that just accepting, like, sometimes I will just watch a Blender, like a YouTuber making something in Blender, and it could even be a tutorial, and it's entertaining, and in some way there is like an educational aspect to it, and it's great for motivation. But to really be learning in Blender, I have to have Blender open and have to be doing things to make it stick. And that's the idea. To learn Blender, use Blender. To cook the omelet, you have to crack the egg. Number 21. So these next 5 will be about just like software and files. So number 21 is presets, and just having that default file with all of the presets in it. This was something I didn't pick up immediately, though it does make sense. I thought it was odd at first when I was thinking like, oh, all the settings are also saved to the file itself. And that seemed a little bit different. I guess I'm more used to Figma, where like settings are more, I was thinking of like, oh, the settings are usually like across all the files. But then I realized, no, that's not actually the case. Like if you set up your guides and you set up things will export, then yeah, that is like preserved across files. And I think creativity, it is just this idea of defaults, having defaults in different environments, and thinking about what your default actions are going to be. I heard this on, I think it might have been Cal Newport. He has a podcast, so he's the author of Deep Work and a few other books, Slow Productivity. But it's this idea of what are your defaults. I think it was with James Clear on an old episode. But if you end up standing in line, what's the default that you're going to, like the default activity that you're going to do to fill that time? Yes, it's a world where like the default is typically to check your phone. And oftentimes it's, oh, let me just do a quick social media check. Or yeah, let me check my messages. Let's check analytics or something like that. But you can switch the defaults up so that it is something a little more productive. An example from David Senra from the Founders Podcast. I don't think it's necessarily like when he's in line, but something that he'll often do is use the Readwise app to review book highlights. Or, yeah, so like thinking about the defaults that you have in different environments. is an important thing. Number 22, automation. So I was rendering, as mentioned, as I'm learning in Blender, I'm trying to document it. So this, as mentioned, I was doing screen recordings, and then I'll do a lot of just like viewport renders so that I have like progress animations for future videos where I want to show like the progress, something as I build it. But I also just want to get in the habit of recording my process, documenting my process. But the problem I ran into is that Blender would not create a unique file name. So I would often like overwrite files early on. And then eventually I set something up. There's an app called Hazel on the Mac that will watch a file directory. And then you can automate some things like rename the file with a date. And that's what I did so that I don't have to think about that each time and then like rename files each time. And this can be a good thing in your creative work. It's figuring out what to automate or at least have a documented process around, so that take your process, just like write it down as a flowchart, and then look at parts of it that you can automate. Like what parts are you repeating that might be able to be something that you automate, but also just like having that process in the first place is really useful for being efficient with your creativity. Not that efficiency and creativity is like the most important thing, but it can be an important thing if the process itself is kind of like holding you back from the creative work. Number 23, the document tax that hopefully will pay off. As mentioned, and I keep saying as mentioned, but I have been doing recording, like screen recordings, setting up OBS and taking screenshots, all sorts of things. And it does take some time and some effort and thought, and that does slow down the learning process itself, because it does add some friction, because I think, before I get into the Blender course that I'm working through, first I need to set up the thing that will record me going through it. And I'm sort of just like accepting that task because I think that it will pay off. And in the creative work, it can be useful to just document the process and share your process. There's a book called Show Your Work by Austin Kleon that is all about this, that if you're just beginning and if you're just learning, or even like in the advanced stages, but early on, the things that you make, the artifacts that you make will not be like of like high enough quality that it is worth like sharing on its own, in the sense of it's not going to impress other people, or like it won't be interesting to other people, but the process might be. So it can be useful to share that process, because that journey will be something that other beginners can relate to. So I'm hoping it'll pay off. And it also, just like as mentioned, getting in the process of doing it is making it easier. I don't have to think about it as much. I kind of have my presets in OBS ready to go, such as one button to record, and I can even set the timer on the recording. I have another thing to automate creating the time lapses, and yeah, it's just this tax on my time I'm willing to pay, because I think the documentation of this learning process, this learning journey, will be worth it. Number 24, sharing, and the end result of it being a short. That's what I've been doing. So I've been learning Blender, but on most days, I've also been sharing my learning, sharing something in the form of a YouTube short. And that has been good to give me like an end result that I want to get to. And I guess this also relates in terms of deadlines. A deadline can be really good in creative work to just make the work more concrete. If it was just, I guess a different way that I could have this is just set my goals as just have a list of the course modules and then feel the satisfaction of finishing a course module. But having a published short and sharing that gives me the satisfaction of shipping some small amount of work to the world, to the audience, to complete the full loop of making something small and sharing that out. And I'm hoping that will build up as well. I'll get more comfortable with sharing that work, with getting feedback, good and bad. And I think that can be really important, is figuring out what audience you want to share to at different stages, what audience will give you the feedback that you need. And early on, actually, it can be just really good to have only positive feedback. Just have that motivation of people encouraging you, where super critical feedback that is, sometimes it is even like well-intentioned, it can be kind of a downer that like just like kills your motivation and then you quit. Number 25, organization, and this idea of your workspace, keeping your workspace organized. This is something that I'm trying to do. So going through these courses, there's just a lot of files that get created. Yeah, go through the course, and then I'm doing like incremental saves, and then trying to be diligent about like keeping these things in different directories. And I need to get better at that. That's probably something that I need to be like learn a little more from the experts to see how they organize different things. And then there's just like the documentation part of it too, that I have like these projects. It's kind of two projects all the time because it's the 3D project itself, like whatever the module is that I'm learning, and then the video, like if I'm making a short that's related to it, then that kind of complicates things. There's just a lot of organization involved. And this reminds me of this book, Every Tool's a Hammer by Adam Savage. Really great book, just about it's about, he's, you know, Mythbusters, so he's making physical things, but I do think a lot of it applies as well to digital work, 3D work, any sort of like creative endeavor. That there's a lot of stuff that's not the creative work itself, and you just want, the reason to get organized with it is because then you don't have to think about it as much, and you can really focus on the creative part, and the creative part can be the most fun part. But there's also just the satisfaction of staying organized. And another book I'd recommend is called Work Clean. So this is mise en place, the cooking concept of prepping and keeping things clean, because then it gives you the momentum. You can stay moving fast when you're doing like the actual creative work itself. These last 5 are not going to be related to, well, it's kind of related to Blender, but not as directly. It's things related to mindset. Number 26, just start. So I haven't done the Blender Guru Donut tutorial yet, but it does seem like a great place to start. It seems like millions of people, certainly hundreds of thousands, have gone through the tutorial and completed it, and that was their start on their journey learning 3D. Said I started with the CG Fast Tracked Minecraft tutorial, which I purchased but also learned it's free on YouTube as well, and I'd recommend that. That's, I guess, as far as just speaking on what I used myself, yeah, that one was a good one for learning to create an environment and do some physics and some animation, and then learn about like lighting and rendering. It was a fun one too, just to, yeah, like results pretty quickly, and I think it's less than 2 hours, so that was fun. And then I'd suggest even just starting with a handful of 1-minute tutorials. There's a lot of shorts now that show you cool effects that you can do, and that might be good just to build up some momentum quickly. You get like this quick outcome. Maybe don't only do that, because then you maybe get impatient with the results, which is what I'm getting to. I think I am in this sort of like impatient mindset. I want to get results in 1 minute instead of putting the work in to learn the fundamentals. Number 27, there are many ways to win. So in Blender, in 3D, there's a lot of ways to, you can picture something that you want to make, and there are a lot of ways to achieve that. I guess as an example, if you want to roll a ball like down a ramp, you can do that with physics, or you could, you know, keyframe it manually if you wanted, and you'll get this outcome that the ball starts here and then it ends up at the bottom of this ramp. But there are good ways and bad ways to do different things. And then sometimes it matters, like the method will matter down the line that you're doing it this way, but the proper way will help down the line somewhere. And this applies in creativity as well, that there are many ways to do different things. Like you want to build an audience on the internet, there are like, you can pick different mediums, you can pick, and then within each medium, you can apply different formats. There are different topics that you can use. And it's like a double-edged sword that the great thing about that is that you can try out all sorts of things. And then the sort of, the downside of that is that you can kind of get frozen by decisions that you don't know what you want to do. Yeah, just a lot of ways. Yeah, you don't know what you want. Yeah, you can get frozen by having to make a lot of different decisions that, yeah, analysis paralysis. So a good thing is to find someone, of course, there's a lot of online teachers, someone that knows what they're doing, and then they'll give a path. You just want to have a few different paths and have someone tell you, pick one and get started. It kind of relates to the previous one. Pick one, get started. Don't try to pick the perfect path. Number 28, become T-shaped, but not yet. So for me, my end goal, I'm still trying to figure that out. As mentioned, like I'm starting to get interested in these like abstract animations, but I don't need to go super deep into, yeah, maybe that means I won't need to go super deep into realistic hard surfaces, but it will be good to do the basics of that. To become T-shaped, that's that idea that you want to learn the fundamental skills and then specialize in one, like a couple things, and go deep into that specialization. But you also do need the bottom of that T. You need the foundation, and that's what I need to focus on. It's just like building up those foundational skills before I go deep into anything. Share. So I chose Blender because there's just so much content about it and so many people using it. Really, it's been super great to stay motivated by looking and watching all the cool stuff that other people are making. And there's just this very generous community where people are sharing assets, people are sharing their process. And I guess I also am not trying to become like I don't have the aspiration to become like a visual effects artist in Hollywood or anything like that. I think that there are people that want to do that. So there's a lot of content also about, why Blender is not used in the gaming industry or used in Hollywood. And in a way, I don't care. I'm grateful that that's not like my goal right now, because then that's even more analysis paralysis of not only how to do things, but what tool should I start with? It's nice to just be able to just learn something new with a generous community is how I would put it. Number 30, the last one, you can just do things, but not right away. There is this meme, this phrase, you can just do things. And that's how I feel with Blender as I'm learning more and more. It's this thing that Blender can kind of do anything. In a way, anything visual could be broken down and built in Blender. Any sort of like visual effects, maybe, a loose definition of any, but it does seem like it can recreate. It can do photorealistic stuff and visual effects and then 3D tracking and then 2D and animation and rigging and all of these things. And you can just do things. That's been a cool thing where I'm like, oh yeah, I want to have 1,000 small blocks and then drop them onto the surface, and then let's just see what happens. And I can do that. And it's also this idea, you can just do things, but not right away. So I do need to continue learning and to continue being patient. Thanks for your patience. If you actually made it to the end of this video, thanks for checking this out and for supporting me. Early subscribers, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. And I'll keep making stuff in Blender.